So I recently had the chance to work with a brand new student, and in just one session I was able to help him go from this ball flight to this ball flight, and I'm going to show you exactly how we did that. So we really broke this into two different elements. We did some backswing work and then we did some downswing work. And I'm going to take you exactly through the steps, and if you do struggle with that first ball flight, these steps will help you. So why was his backswing so important? Well, we know that we don't hit the golf ball with the backswing, but the way he was moving from setup to the top made it very difficult for him to deliver the club as he wanted. So what we were seeing in his backswing was that his back leg, so his trail leg, remained too flexed. What that did was it forced his arms to go too much upwards in the second phase of the backswing. That was the first thing we wanted to address. The second thing I noticed was that when he got to the top, his left wrist was slightly cupped, which had the effect of opening the club face. So we didn't have enough depth, as I explained to him, and the club face was slightly open. That was a recipe for that first shot that we saw. So I'm going to go through the two things that we asked him to do in his backswing. So once he was addressed to the golf ball, as I'm there, what I wanted him to do was, in the early stage of his backswing, I wanted him to feel as if the club face was pointing down towards the ground. So if I move into my takeaway, we've gotten to this point here, club shaft level with the ground, and I was really referring to where he felt like that club face was pointing. Now notice that when I asked him to point the club face down towards the ground, it started to flatten out this wrist or even put an arch in it. What we saw at the top was the wrist was slightly cupped. Here we said it was cupped and the face was open. So by getting him to feel like the club face was pointing down at the ground, it flattened out this wrist very early. Now what he explained to me was that he felt like he was adding a twist to the golf club. That's perfect, because essentially that's what he was doing and that's what I wanted him to do. The instruction then was for him to continue that twist up towards the top. Now when we were making rehearsals and practice swings, I didn't really mind if he over-exaggerated it a little bit, if he actually went to a slightly arched wrist, or even if the club face was slightly closed. That was better than being in this slightly open position. Now what we did during the lesson, we used something like this on the club face, just to give him a little bit more awareness. It just stuck to the club face, and it was a very visual representation of where that club was pointing. So his usual takeaway was something like this. The feel we had was more like this. So left wrist flattened, pointing more down towards the ground. That was how we controlled the club face. I wanted to control it early, and that's how we did it. From there, we wanted to allow him to turn up to the top and allowing a different movement in this trail leg. What I explained to him was that if his hips were rotating, which they were, the more that they rotated, the more that we would start to see the leg straighten. Really important here, I didn't want him from the setup to just straighten the leg. That wasn't the instruction. The instruction was to allow his hips to turn freely and allow his leg to react to that. And again, what I explained to him was that as he was doing that, he would probably start to feel more weight or more pressure through the trail heel. We added a golf ball, and that golf ball went under his lead toe. So now what I was asking him to do was make some backswings where the club face pointed more down towards the ground, and as he turned to the top, his hip turn created a slightly longer trail leg and a little bit more pressure into that trail heel. And what we saw with those two little exercises is we really managed to change where he was at the top of his golf swing. And I was confident that just that alone would help him deliver the club better on the downswing. Yes, we wanted to do some downswing work, and we did, but just those two changes really made a huge difference to where he was at the top, and therefore how he was able to deliver the club to the ball. The phase straight after that was very simply just to let the golf ball get in the way. Now at this stage, I really expressed to him that it didn't matter where the ball went. All I really wanted was to see the club face in a different position, the hips and the legs in a different position, and I asked him to do that with a pause at the top. So he was going pause, pause, hit. And even that one had a little bit of right to left on it. Not all of his shots were great, And that's why we had to do a little bit of downswing work, which we're going to go into now. So let's now take a little bit look at his downswing pattern. And what you're going to find very often is your downswing is based on what you do in the backswing. So my assumption of his golf swing was that because his club face was open at the top, open would suggest that the ball was going to curve to the right, and it kind of was. But because his golf ball was curving to the right, he tended to open his body and almost back his hips up. The club came out this way and he swung across to the left, which makes a lot of sense. You know, he's got an element in there which makes the ball go right, the club face, so we added an element which was a left club path. We'd obviously fixed the backswing or made some improvements there, so therefore we needed to change his downswing pattern. So the two pieces of instruction I gave him, and we'll go into a bit more detail as to how we're going to achieve this, was from the top of his golf swing, I wanted him to keep his head fairly central, but I wanted him to add quite a significant amount of lateral movement. I wanted him to be really forcing or pushing his hips towards the target. He didn't really have much of that at all. He had some rotation, but he didn't have much of this lateral element. Whilst he was doing that, I wanted him to, and I've used this so many times, think about the 5 o'clock drill. So we had him visualize a clock face, and we actually placed one of his tees on the ground at what he felt was 5 o'clock. If 12 o'clock was here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And his second instruction was from his new position at the top to push his hands and the grip down towards this 5 o'clock position. Notice I said hands and grip. I did not ask him to push the club head down because that would have caused him to release these angles. So by pushing his hands and the grip down towards this 5 o'clock position, we lost a lot of that over the top move. And by asking him to move his hips laterally towards the target, we enabled him to strike the ground in the right place. Had I only given him this instruction, he would likely have hit the ground before the ball. Terrible results, almost worse shots, he would have just gone back to his original swing. So we had lots of lateral and the 5 o'clock drill. So we gave him some visuals. We placed an alignment stick on the outside of his lead heel, a fair distance, you know, maybe some 5-6 inches, a hand's width away. And the first thing I asked him to do was make his new backswing and just work his lower body towards that alignment stick. I wanted him to understand what that felt like, understand how he needed to organize his body, and for him to attach his own feels to that movement. I can tell him what to do. He needed to process that himself and attach his own feels and almost relay to me what he was feeling. And what he actually felt, which was great for me to hear, he felt like he was putting more pressure through that lead leg, which is great. That's exactly what he was doing. So as he did that, once he was comfortable with that, we added in the 5 o'clock drill. So that was his hands working down to, say, this area here, that 5 o'clock on a clock face. Now, when we isolated those two movements, his hips going forwards and his hands working down to here, he actually got the golf club far too much behind him. Again, great, this is what I wanted. This is the rehearsal. This isn't perfect swing. Because I knew that in the golf swing, when he added the rotation, guess what? We'd end up in this really nice neutral position. So the rehearsals that he was doing didn't have rotation, which is why it was actually putting him in a position which we don't generally see. The club was far too far behind him. But that was okay. That's what I wanted him to feel. I wanted him to slightly exaggerate this. From here, I knew that as he rotated, he would start to deliver the club. Now, the way I've just demonstrated that is how we had him hit golf balls. And what we saw from this top of the backswing, this and this, I then said to him, just go ahead and clip the ball off the tee. That first shot that he hit with those elements in was the first time he'd seen his irons move right to left. Now, if he was a fader of the golf ball, I don't want him to move the ball right to left long term. I wanted him to do it in practice. Long term, I wanted to work him towards a very neutral ball flight. That was my preference, but I was trying to get him to feel the other side. He'd only ever played left to right, pulls, fades, slices. Initially, I'm trying to give him the opposite feel, get him to understand what elements, what things needed to be in his golf swing to change that pattern. Then, I was fairly confident that as we increased the speed and took out those pauses, that right to left would end up fairly neutral. And that is pretty much exactly what we saw. Now, this was a fairly lengthy lesson. We were with him for quite a few hours. So we took a long time before we actually built up to full speed. And that's a really key message, that he was patient, he was understanding the process, and we hit a lot of shots with a pause here, a pause here, a pause here, and then a swing through. We spent a lot of time doing that, and we were seeing some big right to lefts. Perfect. Then we took out those pauses, we started to increase the speed, we started to take less time to make the golf swing, and that draw started to become straighter and straighter and straighter. And then, before long, he'd started to really marry up the path, the club face. He started to trust it a little bit more, and we started to get some really nice neutral ball flights. So, hopefully, something like this. So that's how we took a student in one session from a big old slice to nice, straight, flushed iron shots.